Okay, U.S. history. Today is the day that me and Teddy tell you why Martin Luther King Jr. has his own holiday. So this is your Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 lecture. Now, you guys all know who Martin Luther King Jr. is. You've learned about him probably every January for the last 10 years. But I'm going to remind you one more time who he is because he's that important. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't always a civil rights activist. I mean, that's what we think of him as, what we remember him as, but he actually by trade was a minister. He was an American Baptist minister, came from a religious family, came from a Christian home. His dad was actually a minister too. And so he grew up, became a minister of his own church, has a wife, a couple kids, and he's just ministering this small church in the South. That's kind of his background. So how does he make the jump from minister to civil rights leader? Because that's who he ends up being, right? He's the face of the civil rights movement from 1954 until 1968. But if I say civil rights movement to you, which I have multiple times this year, you automatically think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s face. So how do we get to that spot where we think about him? And really, to be honest, it all goes back to my girl Rosa Parks, right? Remember when I told you last lecture how amazing she is? She's not just amazing because she decides, I'm not going to get up and go to the back of the bus. I don't want to. I'm going to take a stand for what I believe in. She's not only inspiring for that reason, she inspires Martin Luther King Jr. to get involved. Because remember the Montgomery Bus Boycott we talked about last time, where basically after Rosa Parks refuses to go to the back of the bus, you have all these people in Montgomery who say, you know what, we're going to stand up for what she started, and we're going to try to bring some change to the bus system. We're just not going to ride the buses for one day. Remember the Montgomery Bus Boycott? They decided we're just not going to ride the buses for a day. And it's so successful, right? And it's not only successful, because it brings about what they want. It brings about real change in the bus system, but it just gets people talking because now a movement is forming, right? We have Brown versus Board of Education, so desegregation of schools. We talked about Little Rock 9 at Central High, right? That first school to be desegregated. And now you have Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This is the beginning of something. And so, African Americans, they start thinking, if this is going to turn into a real movement, we need to have a leader. We need to have somebody who's going to get up and give demands and kind of advocate for us in front of the media. So they start looking around at who that's going to be. Now, after the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. gets really inspired by what he sees going on in Montgomery. So he gives a speech, right? He gives this speech about how the bus boycott was so great because it used nonviolent activism, civil disobedience, essentially, to get its point across, and how successful nonviolent protest can be. But he's also talking about how he believes that the civil rights movement that's forming, it should be guided by Christian values, that they shouldn't meet violence with violence. Instead, they should meet the violence of white America with love and with forgiveness, with Christian charity. And it's through that means, nonviolent protest and Christian charity and love, that African Americans will eventually be successful and bring about, the civil rights activism that they've been petitioning for years, right? And so he gives this speech, and immediately people start taking notice of him and saying, that's our guy. And so they start calling him and saying, hey, have you ever thought about being a civil rights activist? And he goes, no, I don't want anything to do with that. I have a young family. I have a church that I'm responsible for. I'm not interested. So they keep calling. And so finally he's praying about it and he's thinking about it. And he says, okay, I'm going to do this. I'll be, basically the face, the leader of this movement. And he does this around the late 1950s. So like 1954, 1957, these decisions are being made. He forms an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? And this is going to be the major civil rights organization that's going to lead all of these different civil rights activities that we see throughout the 1960s. And so Martin Luther King Jr. agrees to be kind of the leader of this movement because of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now, when he says yes to this, he's basically taking on years and years and years of really intense discrimination and personal persecution. I mean, just think about all the things that he endured between 1954 and before his death in 1968. His home gets bombed at one point. His family is constantly receiving death threats. You have nonstop violence and intimidation by the KKK as he's traveling through the South. He's unlawfully arrested when he gets to Birmingham, Alabama. Just all kinds of things, which eventually culminate in 1968 to his death. He's assassinated in Dallas, Texas. But yet, even despite all that persecution, he continues being the leader, the face of this movement for years. And he's very consistent. No matter what speech you listen to, again, you hear the same things out of his mouth. He's talking about nonviolent protest, and he's talking about being governed by Christian love and charity. And so what we see happening as the civil rights movement plays out is that African Americans adopt different tactics in order to inspire change and raise awareness of their goals. They usually work through boycotts, through sit-ins, or through marches. These are the three most common means. Boycott, we've already talked about, right? A boycott is simply just saying, I'm not gonna use a service, or I'm not going to buy something in order to raise awareness for my cause. And so the Montgomery Bus Boycott's the best example of this, because again, African Americans just say, we're not going to use the buses. And it's so successful that one day they decide to do it all year. They do it all year long. They just don't use the buses. And again, it achieves their goal. Finally, the city of Montgomery, they're losing so much money that they're finally like, fine, you can sit wherever you want. Just take the bus again. So that was really successful. Another means that's used is something called a sit-in. This is basically when you go into a business and you just sit there. And again, you sit there all day. You refuse service just to basically raise awareness for your cause. And so this is really popular among college students. Remember in the 1950s, diner culture is really popular. And so you have these college students, and even sometimes high school students, that would go into these diners or these restaurants, and they would just sit along the counter and they wouldn't eat. They just sit there literally all day long. And people would come and harass them. They would dump their milkshakes over their head. They'd throw things at them. And just horrible videos and pictures come out of this era of all of the kind of just terrifying, violence these people suffered as they just sit at this counter. But sit-ins are really, really popular. And then the last, probably most well-known form of nonviolent protest are marches. So you have like the March on Selma, for instance, in the late 50s, early 60s. And then you have, of course, the most famous one, the March on Washington, which this is where we get the I Have the Dream speech, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so you have boycotts, marches, sit-ins that come to kind of characterize the movement. Again, all of these are forms of nonviolent protest, which is something that Martin Luther King Jr. Is encouraging in every speech that he gives. He wants to keep the civil rights movement really positive and again full of love and messages of forgiveness and brotherhood. He wants to bring the country together through nonviolence. Okay. Now, even though African Americans are using nonviolent tactics, they're not always met with the same thing, right? So even though they are being nonviolent, white America is usually meeting their nonviolence with violence. And one of the best examples of this is something called the Freedom Rides, okay? So we talked about how Brown versus Board desegregated schools, but that just gets the ball rolling. And so African Americans start looking around and saying everything needs to get desegregated. We talked about the bus system in Montgomery, but there are buses that are going across state lines. We call these interstate buses. And so you have a group of African American college students who decide, you know what, we're going to board some buses in Washington, D.C., and we're going to travel all the way down to Louisiana, down into the South. And we are going to purposely violate Jim Crow laws. So we're going to use white bathrooms, white water fountains. We're going to sit in white designated areas of the trains, again, to bring awareness to our cause. We want to desegregate the entire bus system, not just in cities, but across state lines as well. And so this Freedom Ride, it's called the Freedom Rides. It's staged by CORE, which was that same organization we talked about that formed in World War II. They started in 1961, and again, they're traveling from Washington, D.C., all the way down to Louisiana. Now, as they travel deeper into the South, they are faced with all kinds of violence, right? So you even have like mobs that would meet these Freedom Riders, meet these trains, at different stations, and basically just, you know, yell horrible things, throw things at the buses. One of the buses actually gets bombed at one point. It gets so bad that President Kennedy actually has to call in federal troops and state troopers just to protect these freedom riders, just like we saw with the Little Rock Nine, where you had the troops that stayed with them throughout the entire school year. The same thing happens to these freedom riders. Now the question becomes, how does Kennedy know to do this, right? How does anyone know what's going on? This is where television comes into play, right? Because TVs are in almost every single American home by the time we get to the 1960s. So Americans are watching this happen. Now imagine the effect if you see these African Americans who are just sitting on the bus, again, nonviolent protest, but what are they being met with? They're being met with violence. All of a sudden, as a white American, you have tension, right? Like, you have to reconcile this, because are you going to be on the side of the violence, even though they're the same color of your skin, or are you going to be on the side of African Americans who are using nonviolence, right? And if you find yourself on the side of the African Americans who are being peaceful, then, you know, what decision do you have to make, right? And so this is kind of uncomfortable for white America as they're watching all of these things play out on TV. And it makes President Kennedy really uncomfortable. So much so that, again, he decides to protect these freedom riders as they travel to Louisiana. Now he does kind of comes with a catch. He makes a deal with them and he says, listen, you are technically breaking real laws. Remember, Jim Crow laws are still in effect. So even though we're going to protect you, they're going to have to arrest you when you get to your destination. So in Louisiana, when they arrive, these freedom riders are all arrested for violating Jim Crow laws, but they do actually, you know, get what they wanted. The interstate bus system is desegregated largely because of their actions. So this is significant because, again, it shows that this movement, it's not going to stop. It's not going to be deterred by violence. Like, you can bomb their buses at this point, and guess what? They're still going to keep going. And this is important because they've gained a really important ally. They've gained the federal government, right? You have President Eisenhower and now President Kennedy, who have both sent federal troops to protect African Americans who are demonstrating nonviolently. And so this is a really important precedent because, again, it shows that the President of the United States, the federal government, is allied with the civil rights movement. And so Kennedy, in June of 1963, he actually makes a promise to them, and he says, listen, I'm going to pass some big legislation. I'm going to bring you a civil rights act that desegregates the entire country. And this is a huge promise. This is what they've wanted all along, but it's taking a really long time for Kennedy to actually do it. And so African Americans decide, you know, we need to do something to put pressure on President Kennedy. And that is when you get the March on Washington, which, again, is what we all remember, all know. This is when Martin Luther King gets up and gives his I Have a Dream speech. So you have on August 28th, 1963, about 250,000 people that come out to the Washington Memorial, Washington, D.C., and this is where, again, Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his I Have a Dream speech, where you guys are going to listen to it today. And you're actually going to watch it on a YouTube video because it's one of those things you just got to see. And he talks about, again, bringing together white America and Black America and uniting them in love and forgiveness and forming one nation. And he talks about how this is his dream. But you have to think, again, this is the era of television. So it not only inspires the 250,000 people who are there watching the speech, this thing is nationally broadcasted. So millions of Americans are watching this speech take place, watching this march take place. So it's really, really powerful on a national level, not just there in Washington, D.C. But then catastrophe strikes. November 1963, Kennedy is assassinated, right? Now, this is catastrophe because Kennedy was an ally of the movement. And so a lot of African Americans are like, what are we going to do now? President Kennedy's gone. He's the one who made us this promise. Well, the guy who takes his place, his vice president, his name is Lyndon B. Johnson. Kind of a tricky fellow. We're going to talk about him quite a bit. President LBJ, he decides, you know what? I'm going to make good on Kennedy's promise. I am going to bring civil rights legislation to America in honor of Kennedy. And that's when we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is what officially desegregates everything in the United States, right? So Brown versus Board desegregated schools, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it desegregates the entire country. It makes segregation illegal in our country. And it actually says if you try to segregate, different facilities or businesses, we're going to use the federal government, federal troops to actually stop you. So it outlaws discrimination based on race, color, sex, and national origin, where you're from nationally. So it is a major civil rights accomplishment that not only applies to African Americans, but really all people of color, all different religions, all genders. Nobody can discriminate you based on these factors because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So super, super important. I hope you enjoy the I Have a Dream speech that you guys are going to watch after this. It's super moving. It's something I see every year, and it just moves me even more every time I see it. But anyways, until next time, wash your hands, and we'll see you soon.